everyone. Today we have our another new episode. This is our 710th episode. We will discuss on climate change impact. We have our world famous speaker, Professor David Schumacher, Professor David Smith, Madam Beth Laugh. After a long time, she joined Mr. Gary and Professor Ron. Climate change is a very important, specifically country like Bangladesh, India, Maldives, Indonesia. Uh, World Talent Economy Forums, we are working in the different grassroots level and we are observing, we are doing research on climate change. Uh, Millions of people actually affected by the climate change, uh, uh, earthquake, flood, environment change, lot of things happening. We are working with mangrove, which may be important for our emerging economy. Hopefully, this dialogue can help us to take more actions and take more initiative. First, I would like to give chance Sir David Schumacher.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Sharif and everyone else and audience out there. Thanks for that kind of brief overview. You know, when people think of climate change impact, I think they think of some of the things that, you just spoke about, Dr. Sharif. I did a look around and I find that it seems like the impacts are really quite widespread. And the way I want to begin my opening remarks today is talk just very briefly about that. I think there's a lot said about that. Maybe talk about some impacts that I hadn't considered on like which countries are most impacted. And then I want to talk a little bit about surprisingly the geopolitical landscape and what climate change means to that. And that's one area I think that doesn't get talked about quite enough, at least hasn't come my way. Anyway, when we think of climate change, obviously, at least I think of, rise in temperature and lowering of sea level. But what does that mean? That means that things that have been covered in ice or covered in water previously are now out and available in the open air. And we don't necessarily, as humans, have resistance to some of those things that have been covered up. And I think we'll see increased respiratory and other articles even say cardiovascular issues. Of course, heat is a problem as well. There are parts of the planet that are already very hot. I live in Phoenix, Arizona, where 40, 45 degree Celsius temperatures are not uncommon in the summertime. And for those on the Fahrenheit schedule, that's about 110 to 120. It's going to get hotter. And there's other parts of the world that are already in that situation. So we'll see impacts due to heat-related events, not only on ourselves, but also on plants, infrastructure, and those that are around us. And that leads to something that came up as a major talking point during COVID. All of this change, all of this disruption has an impact on mental health. And that's something else that can't be ignored, I think, as far as an impact of climate change. Moving to my second topic, countries. So I was looking to see countries that would be most impacted by this. And there's a number of different lists out there I found, and they don't all agree. But obviously, island nations like Japan are affected because of coastline area, and we've seen issues like that. And non-island areas like India have already shown great impacts as far as this is concerned. Best we can tell, there are different ways to judge this, and I'm open to talking about them if someone has a slightly different point of view. But we can look overall at what's been happening on the planet, and we come up with surprising situations. I mentioned India. That's probably not a surprise. Japan, Philippines wouldn't be a surprise. Germany was a surprise to me. I mean, there's a European country that I don't think of as obviously an island nation, yet they have started to experience severe periods of heat waves and so forth that they hadn't had in the recorded past anyway. Another surprise on the list for me was Canada, which is just to the north of me. And it's actually the part of the planet that is warming on average the fastest, from what I read. Hadn't thought about that. But that leads into the geopolitical discussion. I'm going to try to put a slide up. Let's see if I can do this. That here we go. Sure. Oh, there we are. I can now see it on the screen. Yeah, okay. So what this is it's a map of the North Polar region. It's talking about Canada's routes. Now, the north of Canada today is frozen between Canada, Denmark, and the other countries that you see up there. But as temperature rises, more of this ice will melt. And in the top picture, what you see is the area that shows the area that's most going to have ice that will be melting. This changes the navigation routes. There was a dream hundreds of years ago of trying to find an east-west passage across the north. Well, it looks like that's going to happen as ice melts. So that has implications as far as commerce, obviously shipping and so forth. But the geopolitical aspects of it is it opens up coastline and opens up trade routes that have never been in contention before. It opens up ports for both civilian shipping and naval vessels that have not been open before. Before the pandemic in 2019, I attended Ocean Planet Conference in Los Angeles, and there were two notable speakers there that were talking about this. One of them was the dean of the Naval Academy, and the other one was a ship's captain that had worked in this area. They were talking about really needing to look at being able to ensure free and open shipping, which is one of the goals of the United States Navy, and I would imagine navies of the other world as well. And then there are people that have maybe less laudable goals. Nevertheless, this whole area to the north will be drastically changed and will affect many, many different areas of our lives, in good areas as well as bad, but it's a new area to focus on. So, Dr. Sharif, those are my opening comments.
Thank you. Now I request Professor David Smith.
Well, David, I love your insights, particularly as you look at the geopolitical impact of climate changes, because they are pretty pervasive. But also, there's also pretty extremes. I mean, we have places where the climate change has, as you stated, raised the temperatures. We actually have other parts of the world where the climate change has lowered the temperature. We have places where the droughts are severe, but other places where, because of climate change, we have flooding that hasn't been historical flooding. So we need to understand, as in so many things, it's a complex system, and that climate change is not a one parallel path that affects everyone the same way. And that's what makes climate change so hard to deal with, is it is that a complex system, and it works with systems of systems across many different domains. And we really have to understand that. And some of the facts behind climate change that are indisputable, and how they were there. Taken though as a whole, as we look at all the published evidence everywhere, that the net damage costs of climate change are likely to be very significant, and increase over time. And the impacts of that are going to be pretty severe, I think, as we see it. We know from the United Nations, we know from other international bodies and things, even out of COP 27 that happened in Egypt. We need to see that global action is necessary to deal with climate change impacts. And David, you began to get into parts of that as you look at there, but it has to become even more pervasive than that. Unfortunately, climate change is not a local activity. It's not a regional activity. It's not a national activity. It truly is all the nations of the world coming together and have to act as much as possible in concert for it to have a true impact there. That climate change does not respect a national border line. And what I do in one country affects all the countries around it. Indeed, based on the scale of what it is, it affects a lot more than just one country, as we see, for example, out of China and others as it's getting there. You know, this is something that's going to take time to deal with and time to respond to. So we see that there's predictions that the sea level will raise by at least between 1 to 8 feet by 2100. And what we've seen, though, is since the beginning of record keeping back in the 1880s, the sea level has gained about 8 inches. And so you can see that a foot to 8 foot is going to be very, very consequential. We know that climate change is going to continue through the century. And that the targets, the goal was to keep climate, was to try to help mitigate and keep the increases to about 1.5 degrees. It looks like it's going to be closer to 3 going forward. Hurricanes, other things will become stronger. We've seen that more intense, more droughts, more heat waves, longer wildfire season, changes in the way participation, our weather patterns dramatically are changing. We're going to see growing seasons change. In some places, growing seasons will lengthen because the frost-free season is getting longer. In others, they're going to shorten because of the impacts of the heat and others like that. We're going to see places, for example, like the Arctic, where we're beginning to see land and stuff that we haven't seen in a long time. And that's going to have an impact overall. And we're going to see impacts to the economy because of that. We're going to see threats to safety and health because of this extreme weather. And again, it's not just the heat side, but it's also flooding and things brought on by it. You're going to see, particularly to people, changes in heat stroke and others. And there's many others as we get through and can talk about diseases and others. But we need to look at a way to pull together a global understanding on this. Every country recognizes something that needs to be done. And I think particularly after COP27, where money is being made available to the poorest development nations and all, particularly focusing on Africa and some of the others, that there's going to be money made available to help deal with the damages caused by climate change, that we need to come together. I would love to see a better roadmap put together. The problem with the plans that the United Nations and others have put together is it's one size fits all. And that doesn't work in this. Why do I say roadmap? Well, if you think about the old paper maps, not the GPS ones, but the paper maps, what they showed I'm going to use a United States example. That if I wanted to drive from Austin to Washington D.C., I had hundreds different paths. I could take toll roads. I could take the interstates. I could take a scenic route. I could do other ways to get there. As we address climate change, we actually need a roadmap that shows you all these different courses. What do I, as one of the top 5 nations in the world, need to do, particularly if I'm one of the heavier polluters? What do I need to do if I'm in the collection of the poorest nations in the world? That's going to be a different route on that roadmap. What do I need to do with the other types of things? And so instead of like the plans out of the United Nations, where it's one path roadmap, we need to do a roadmap that shows the toll roads, the expressways, the interstates, the back roads of how do we solve climate change to let people have a plan that can work across all the different countries and the country sizes, but yet still work in harmony to see we need to go from Austin, Texas to Washington, D.C. And here's the path it takes to get there. So, Sharif, I could keep on going, but that I think is a good place to stop on my opening remarks.
Thank you. Now I request Professor Ron.
Uh, Hello, everyone. I have a limited time this morning because one of the regulars here in this forum, Don Steiny, got hit by a car the other day, and I'm taking him to the doctor. He cracked a bone, and he's doing fine, but I'm helping him with that. So, first of all, I want to recognize today is the day of celebration for Greta Thunberg, who's been very vocal in challenging our global community and our leaders in climate change. She is now 20 years old, no longer a teenager. So that also means that I think just another way of saying that we have to take young people seriously, and we must be very grateful for all that she has done till now. I have a Swedish origin myself, and so I very much appreciate the efforts of young people like herself. Secondly, I put in my name there, energycrisis.com, a website I created in the 1990s, talk about resource depletion. Much of our concerns about climate change focus on the atmosphere. I just want to say that geology is also very important, and we must understand the limits of our fossil fuel heritage. And I got started in this realm largely because I was more concerned at the time in my youth that we consider the limits of use of fossil fuels in our generation. Here we are, in my lifetime, we've consumed more than half of the once and forever endowment of this material, which in future generations may be very, very useful for humanity. So people think that this transition might be something very, very reasonable, and we can go from step to step. But I created at the time I first began looking at this, what I call Swenson law. Everybody can be entitled to have a law of their own. So I'm going to read it here from my website. To avoid deprivation resulting from the exhaustion of non-renewable resources, humanity must employ conservation and renewable resources substitutes sufficient to match depletion. And I show in a graph that what happens if we don't is that we have deprivation. And we are facing deprivation. There are many debates going along about whether renewable energy is sufficient and so forth to meet our needs. I have one scenario is that to the extent that we can create renewable energy resources such as solar panels, it gives the next generation a chance to grab onto just a little bit of that resource in the case that everything pretty much falls apart in society. You'll be much more help in your future if you have one solar panel compared to one tank of gasoline in your car. So um, I just want to say one more thing, that we cannot count on anybody else to solve this problem. The greatest myth is this is somebody else's problem. So I encourage everyone who's listening to take responsibility. You cannot depend upon the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. They are not getting it right. You cannot count on your own government. They're not getting it right. You cannot count on business. Business is focusing on extracting, destroying, and calling that income. If I tear down a tree, I make income, but the planet is deprived of that tree. So I say that every individual must take responsibility and find a way to do their part in whatever way they know to do. And I have to leave now. I'm sorry to leave abruptly, but I look forward to hearing the recording and the rest of the folks have to say here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Ron. Now I request Mr. Gary.
Gary, you need to unmute yourself. Unmute yourself.
Sure, come on and be
That's better. It's better.
Conversation. For me, that carbon credit have we control as human beings. Those things is activity of all the machinery, the vehicles, ships, anything that burns fossil fuel. And human activity is almost 100% of the increase of greenhouse gases over the past 150 years. We are the responsibility. We're the ones who's doing it. And total emissions they had in 2020 was 5,981 tons of emissions was out there, which is pathetic. And on that, transportation is 27%. And that number is even skewed a little smaller because of COVID. Everybody stopped driving. A lot of cars were off the road. I remember I live in LA, and I remember I had to get out for something, and it was, you could see LA from way out in the burbs where before you couldn't because of the smog and everything. So that number is probably, that percentage is probably higher. Electric production is responsible for about 25%. Industry is responsible for about 24%. Commercial and residential is responsible for approximately 13%. Agriculture has about 11%, and land use and forestry is about 13% of that. We need to get out. We need to do our best to reduce that. And one of the ways that the government is suggesting that we reduce it on like power plants and fuel switching is to increase the efficiency of existing fossil fuel power plants by using advanced technology, substituting less carbon intensive fuels, and shifting generation from higher emitting power plants. So their suggestion, and I can go over, I have a couple other ideas here, that it's all about restructuring their company, restructuring what they're doing. The cost of doing that is incredible. And that's why I feel in the business of what I've done and what I've seen over is that it's the cost. It's the cost of getting into it. I think everybody that I have spoken to, no matter what business they're in, no matter what they're doing, we all want to reduce emissions. We all want to do our best as humans to reduce what we're increasing. You know, an example is like connecting a coal-fired boiler, go to natural gas. But to change something over from where you're using diesel or coal or something else, it's a cost there, and that's what these plants and that's what these companies are afraid to do. You know, in transportation, you know, they suggest to use fuels that emit less CO2 than fuels that we're currently burning. use alternate sources. Alternate sources is natural gas. I worked for Pepsi for a few years around the world. And one of the things that a couple of the plants that we did, we went through gas, and it did burn a lot cleaner. It was, but the cost of converting over was the problem of what we did. You know, in the commercial sector, you know, the government suggests reduce usage, you know, change systems, fix your air conditioning, refrigeration, reduce leakage on that, use freons that lower the global warming. You know, again, things to it's all of it has a cost factor. All of it is to reduce. I know David spoke about some of the problems from global warming, which is right. Changes in rainfall. We have floods in some area, droughts in other, intense rains. It goes from regular rains, flood, where it messes up the crop, everything. Then we have heat waves. You know, oceans are more acidic than it is. Ice caps melting, levels are rising, influence crop yields because of dry or extra wet. You know, it affects human health. I mean, let's face it. Look at the problems Mexico City had for a while back in the 70s, where you couldn't even see the city from up above. It was so full of smog, and it was terrible on people's health. People were getting sick. A lot more respiratory problems than they're having. You know, you have changes to forests and other ecosystems. You know, it's going to impact our energy supply. So there's a lot of things out there that what we're doing, human beings, that we're putting out there. And my feeling is, and what I've tried to do in my life, is to reduce what I do. Reduce it, maybe not in usage, because we are humans, and I think reducing usage is a problem, because we love using what we have. We invented it to make life easier, but then there is repercussions on things. So what I want to look at, and what I want to do, is I want to see people talk about, a lot of the governments talk about reduce and do this, do that, but they never, it seems most of the time, it seems like a video special, like they're doing it to get votes, or they're doing it to stay in power. They're doing it to try to get money in a certain sector that maybe is supported by certain people. You know, us people, the laymen, we're the ones who have to step up and do it. And we spoke about that earlier, somebody had said. So for my opening statement is I have some ideas of what we can do. I have some offers that I want to let you guys know that's out there that we can reduce, and we can start reducing now. Again, it's like a puzzle. You know, you have to, I don't think everything can go to zero immediately, but if you do a little bit in this sector and a little bit in that sector and a little bit in that sector, and, you know, if worst case scenario, let's stop adding. Let's at least stay even and start reducing, and that's what I'll discuss later in this podcast. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Betlav.
Thank you, Dr. Sharif, for having me on again, and thank you, everybody. It's been a very rich discussion so far. So I'm glad that it was brought up that you know, there's been some thorough coverage of what some of the impacts are around the world, and also that there are differential impacts depending on where you live, and a lot of that has to do with income, but it's not entirely about that. But of course, poor island nations, you know, some have gone underwater already, and here I am in California in a fairly wealthy area, and the impacts are less, but we haven't escaped the impacts entirely. I no longer call it climate change. I use the words climate crisis. It's certainly not a siloed crisis. It's a crisis, an environmental breakdown of all of our environmental systems, and some are even in worse shape than the climate. The climate in some ways gets the most attention, and in some ways appropriately so, because one of the impacts that has not yet been mentioned is that we're really looking at, if we don't make major changes in the way we use the earth and in the relationship that we have with the earth and the other living beings with whom we share the planet, if we don't make major changes and very quickly, the biggest impact of the climate crisis will be the loss of life as we know it on this planet. And I don't say the destruction of the earth, because the earth is a self-renewing system, and I believe that it will be okay no matter what. But there may be no living creatures here at all, and certainly it won't be life as we know it. And the earth cannot support the lifestyles that we're having, for all the systems are breaking down. And as I said, it has differential impacts. It also has differential inputs. So those of us in the developed world are living in such a way that it would take 2.5 or 3.5 Earths to support us. And we've been subsidized by the poverty in the developing world. And as the developing world becomes more developed and gets more money, they want to live like us. And so it's straining the boundaries of the Earth system even more. I really love the planetary boundaries construct, and I'll put a link in the chat when I finish talking. But it talks about all the different boundaries, and there's this beautiful vision of living within those boundaries, put out by Kate Raworth, who is an economist. And she has a vision of, instead of holding the goal of our economic development being the largest bottom line for the corporations, or gross domestic product or gross international product, that taking those away as the goal, and instead having the goal be the thriving of all life. Hers is all human life, but I add the rest of life, because we can't thrive if the rest of life is suffering. That's become very clear. But the goal is the thriving of life within the boundaries of our Earth system. And that is possible. And if we make that our goal, we can do that. So I want to say that one of the things I want to say is that there are climate refugees already. So I want to reinforce what's been said by both of the Davids, that we're not waiting for this, for this crisis that's on the horizon looming, for this moment when we cross 1.5 degrees centigrade. The crisis is happening already. There were thousands of climate refugees here in Santa Cruz County in California because of the fires that were mentioned, right? So the impacts are becoming much more widespread and are really impacting more people. But again, it's not a siloed crisis. It's not just the climate crisis. It's the biodiversity crisis. It's the ocean dead zones. It's the destruction of our air. It's just very widespread. The loss of it's not just biodiversity crisis, but also biomass. We've lost a tremendous amount of wildlife, and it's not inevitable. It's not inevitable that we go to that last worst place where we all die and where we take the rest of life with us. That is not inevitable. And so I want to say that, like the Chinese word, people know the Chinese word for crisis is also the word for opportunity, that this is a spiritual opportunity. This is a humanitarian opportunity. This is a call to stewardship of the earth and all of the living beings that we share the earth with. And what's not been mentioned here, a couple things that haven't been mentioned yet, is the feedback loops. As that Arctic ice melts, as that Canadian frozen area retreats, we're exposing darker soils instead of white ice to the sun. And so we're absorbing more heat instead of sending it out into space. And there are things we can do personally, but there are also things that governments and corporations must do. We all must do this together. Another thing that has not been mentioned is that even if we go all the way to 100% green energy, if we take out, and I don't count natural gas as green energy, natural gas is fracked, it's an environmental nightmare. But if we have all of our energy, solar, wind, all green energy, we are still not going to avoid going over 1.5 degrees centigrade. And it's pretty much agreed now that 1.5 is about as high as we can go without having so many of those tipping points, so many of those feedback loops, that it goes out of control and it's unpredictable. Even the scientists don't know exactly what will happen because of these feedback loops. And so even if we go, so it could be like, okay, well, let's just give up, right? Because no matter what we do, we're we're out of luck, right? Because if we get rid of all the use of fossil fuels, we still aren't going to make it. Well, no, there's hope, because there's a bigger and earlier contributor to this situation than fossil fuels. Humans have been changing the land to raise crops and primarily to raise livestock for 10,000 years. That's a lot longer than we've been abusing the fossil fuels, okay? And as we chop down forests, which are the best at sequestering carbon, right? And we instead converted that land to grazing land or to raise crops to feed to animals, that started the warming trend. Yes, it accelerated with the Industrial Revolution, but it started accelerating from the land use change. And the land use change is one of the biggest causes now. If we stop eating the animals, or if we at least drastically reduce the amount of animals that we're raising for food, what happens if we rewild that land or reforest that land is that we start sequestering carbon. And not only that, we reduce drastically the short-lived emissions of methane, nitrous oxide, black carbon, the soot that burning a forest will cause. Super potent greenhouse gases. That black carbon is 3,000 times more warming than carbon dioxide molecule per molecule. And so if we reduce those short-lived greenhouse gases, we buy ourselves some time to start drawing down carbon in other ways, to start reducing fossil fuels or eliminating fossil fuels. One other thing I want to add, and then I think that's the only thing I want to add, is that what isn't often talked about in the conversation, I was studying this stuff for years before I learned that when you burn fossil fuels, there are these warming emissions that are released, warming gases that are released, but there are also cooling particles that are released that somewhat offset, at least in the short term, that heating. But in the long term, the overall impact is warming because carbon dioxide lasts in the atmosphere for hundreds, thousands, some of it's even there 10,000 years later. I do this true confession often where I say, I'm still driving a gas car. I'm eating vegan, which is a bigger impact, but I'm still driving a gas car. And when I drive my car, which is seldom, those emissions, those carbon dioxide emissions that I'm putting into the atmosphere driving my car, some of them are going to still be here in 10,000 years, right? So the legacy carbon that's already in the atmosphere is going to continue warming things. We have to cool things down with the short-lived gases, with the methane, which is largely from fracking and from animal agriculture. Those are the two largest sources of methane. And methane is a powerful, potent gas. We need to stop putting that into the atmosphere so we can quickly bring the temperature down. The nitrous oxide, the black soot. So it's a humanitarian crisis. It's a spiritual crisis. It's a total environmental breakdown is happening, but it's a call to stewardship. It's an opportunity for us to stand up. I think of the climate crisis as the biggest opportunity that has ever faced us. If we come together as a human species and do this thing together, that will be the most amazing thing we have ever done. And I believe that with all my heart, and that's what I'm working toward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Talib.
Hello, am I heard okay? I'm heard okay? Thank you. Thank you. I hate to be the only one that speaks for the developing world, but that's what I'm doing here. That's why I'm here, I think, Dr. Sharif. So I think the developing world is a receiver of this crisis. The developing world is not the creator of this crisis because the main industry developed in the West, in the developed countries, and we are recipients of this. But what is happening now to us is different from what you are describing. You are all describing a real crisis. But if you ask an ordinary man in the streets here, in our part of the world, what the climate crisis would be, he wouldn't be interested. He's more interested in his food for the day, in changing his government, in having to breathe democracy, in having to sustain his livelihood today. So not think about tomorrow, unfortunately. But, I was in Cyprus, for example, a while ago. And I was at the climate change conference because I believe in all what Mr. Gary has said, what Mrs. Lova said also. And I was told that the Eastern Mediterranean region is and the Middle East altogether is one of the hottest spots in the world. Well, that's not felt in our part of world, unfortunately. It's a fact, because we are recipients of all of this. Now, even when the COP27 was launched in Egypt, it was launched because they wanted a conference there, not because they really believe in that. People in the streets don't believe in that, don't believe that they are responsible for this problem, unfortunately. Now, what can we do to change that? We can do a lot. We have to work with governments. Like COVID, climate change has no borders. It doesn't believe in borders. It believes in only cooperation between countries, cooperation between people, nations. And that's only done through governments, unfortunately, because the governments are responsible for raising the awareness of this and acting together. I believe in acting together. Don't misunderstand me, please. I'm just trying to be honest in conveying what's happening in our part of the world. Now, another thing is the issue of climate change and our society. Now, our society here receives aid only to deal with the consequence of climate change. They don't receive aid to let them do the work that would prevent the work that Mrs. Love has just talked about, and Mr. Gary just talked about, and David Smith. I don't know about David Schumacher. I'm sorry I came a bit late in this. So, sorry. I have to put that off. Now, I was saying that that the issue of COP27 being held in Egypt, and the next COP would be held in Dubai also, in our part of the world. It's not a
Can you unmute, please? Dr. Talib, can you unmute, please?
Dr. Talib, you got muted somehow. You're still muted.
Dr. Talib, I cannot hear you. I think, Dr. Talib, can you join again? Then I think, uh, Dr. Talib, can you join again? I'm sorry about Dr. Talib. Mr. David Schumacher, what's your concluding remarks?
Thank you, Dr. Sharif. I invite the opportunity. I'm
Hear me now?
happy.
Can you hear me now?
Let
Can you
Dr.
hear me?
Talib finish.
Okay. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, now.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Okay, it was the connection, it's not good. Okay, what I was saying is the following, that like COVID, the climate change doesn't recognize borders. But the people here are so dependent on governments. You know, people are moving in certain direction of livelihood now. And they are not going to listen to what you're saying. They don't feel the graveness of this. I feel it as a human being. I feel it, but I'm not typical person here. So what we need to do is we need to educate our people in a different way. We need to move them into becoming part of the human community, of the world community that you all represent here. So I'm saying this because I was saying something and it slipped my mind. I was saying something before. Okay. Now, what I'm saying is the following. If people are not coming together, this world is coming to an end. Unfortunately, we know that. We educated people know that. But the ordinary man in the street doesn't know that. He thinks that this is an imposed agenda like all other agenda from the Western world to us, from the developed world to the developing world. He doesn't recognize that this is something that all human beings must deal with. Now, the COP28 is going to be held in Dubai now. That doesn't mean anything. It only means that these people are so eager to get these conferences held in their country. It's to say that we are doing a good job. But in reality, they don't do anything. And the kind of aid that they get, I was commenting what Mr. David Smith said, that the aid is to deal with the problems of Maldives, for example, and rising sea levels, and the other symptoms that are happening around the world. We feel it every day. It's very, very cold here in Jordan now. That's not very normal now. But climate has been changing drastically. Now, what I mean to say is the following, that people are going to continue to resist this until the aid comes to deal with the problem, not to remedy the effects of the problem, Mr. Smith. You understand what I'm saying? Okay, that's what I wanted to say for my opening remarks. I'm sorry, Sharif, I have to leave in 10, 15 minutes. Please, okay? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Dr.
Okay,
Talib.
thank you.
Uh, yeah. Mr. David Schumacher, what's your concluding remarks?
Dr. Sharif, I am grateful that we have this opportunity to discuss climate change impacts, both for the developed world and the developing world. And yes, there's different points of view from those different parts of the world. But as pointed out by many of the speakers, we're all in one boat here. This is all encompassing as far as we go. We've talked about, and I brought up some of the negative impacts of of climate change. But I don't do that to spread fear. I do that to try to bring information It seems that fear is a natural human reaction, and it's much better to try to get people looking at a positive path forward.
Rallying around something.
Negative, putting out the negative vibes, if you will, is disempowering. I find people shy away from conversations. They don't want to admit it. But if we can present a positive agenda that relies on innovation that we can implement, and implementation is key, that takes us forward. There aren't any perfect solutions. Okay? There are no perfect solutions, but we can do better. And we've got to continue to do better. We need to implement what we can do now, continue to review what we're doing now, and make changes and continue to go better. So what's better? Better is having everybody having a voice in what's going on. So what I like about our discussions here is that we get different points of view. Everybody's got a seat at the table. And we all know better when we see it, but sometimes it can be hard to describe. But we can move better. We need those many voices. And realize, as I said, that there are no perfect solutions. Like, for example, I live in Phoenix, Arizona, where it's hot and sunny and bright a lot of the time. I have solar on my roof. That's better, right? Okay, I've reduced my carbon footprint, and I can calculate how I do that, but it doesn't take it to zero. And that there are elements in those solar panels that sit on my roof that I'm going to have to, or we as a society are going to have to deal with sometime down the road. But somebody talked about being able to buy its time as we move forward. It's a little noisy there in the background. If everybody could mute, it's not, I would appreciate it. So we need to keep in mind that every action we take changes things. And some of those changes are negative changes that we don't know about until we do them. That's why we need the constant review, and we need to keep moving forward and keep on a trajectory that takes us in the direction that we want to go. I could give you some other examples, but I see we're getting long on time, and I'll just leave it at that. Action is what's required to move forward. Action, implementing innovative solutions. And while I represent science and technology in my blog and elsewhere, it focuses on how those benefit humans, but that's not the only area of innovation. I heard some others here this morning that are good too. That's why we need all the voices at the table. Thank you very much, Dr. Sharif.
Sharif,
You need to
you're
unmute
muted.
yourself. Unmute yourself.
Mr. David Smith, what's your concluding remarks?
Well, Sharif, thank you so much for the opportunity. I believe the word of the year for 2022 will be unmute yourself, but that's just kind of being here today. This issue, as was said, is a very complex one, and Dr. Talib, I agree with your assessment that the impact on developing nations and developed nations and the poor developing nations and all are very different, and there's not a global understanding. The common person on the street here in Texas is actually under the same opinion as you see in your part of the world as well. I can have no impact. It doesn't affect me. And what can I do? So the education is going to be extremely important as we look at this, as well as the education to governments, because most governments today tend to think as isolationists still. And this is a global problem that we have to break that isolationism in those governments, because it's not just the climate that is being impacted here. You know, we see the changing climate, and Beth and others have done a great job of talking about, but we also can see water. The impact on water is tremendous, you know, from droughts everywhere to, like I said, flooding to the snowpack to everything. And you're seeing that the changing salt level in the oceans and others is becoming thing. Our food supply depends on climate and weather conditions, and we need to look at how we globally can adapt to these changing patterns and respond to them. And that is, Dr. Khalif, in many ways, the impact on food and food production is more of a developing nation issue than it is a developed nation issue because of the different ways we view science and how science can be impacted in that. You're also seeing the whole human health side, just to stay in agriculture a minute. You're seeing more heat stroke and more exhaustion in there. You're seeing more problems with breathing. You're seeing dry conditions. You're seeing with this intense flooding in some parts of the world, new diseases that are waterborne that have never been there before. Infrastructure. Infrastructure is one that's going to be heavily impacted with climate change as well, and particularly as we see the population that lives in coastal areas, the population that has lived in arid areas with deserts and things are going to be impacted disproportionately. But it's really most important right now to talk just a moment about the educational impact, because Dr. Talib and others, I think that is the place where we need to begin to really focus more of the action, not just with the kids in the elementary school. We need to do education across the entire spectrum of us. You've heard me say many times on these different broadcasts, we're in a time of lifelong learning. And particularly about climate change, this is a time where we need to ramp up our education that we can do. We need to pay particular importance to education to the common people, like Dr. Sleeve says. But we also need to focus on commercial. We need to focus on government. Most government officials have no training in how to deal with a complex issue like this. So how can we give government people training on how to deal with a complex issue like climate change? How can we put tools in place that allow global collaboration? Because most countries, and Dr. Talib, thank you for reminding us again, that the developing nations often have much fewer tools for collaborating globally, much fewer tools for being able to handle this on a national basis than some of the developed nations. And we need to work to make those tools and the training how to use them available. But this is a complex problem, and it's a systems problem, and we need to understand that we need to educate everyone on how to use those and how to be effective and how to deal with this issue. So Dr. Sharif, thank you so much for the time and letting me be part of this very important discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. Madam Bitla, what's your concluding remarks?
Thank you. I was just rapidly typing something in the chat, and I'll just share some of what I was typing. So thank you, everybody. Thank you particularly, David, for really fleshing out some of the interrelated problems with, water, climate, desertification, food systems, differential impacts. And thank you, Dr. Talib. I think I had mentioned that there were differential impacts, but I did not do it from the perspective that you do as someone on the ground in the developing world. And I really want to emphasize in closing that those of us in the developed world who have caused the problem to a greater degree have an extra onus in terms of responsibility to change our way of living on this earth. And that the developing world needs to have a chance to catch up in some ways, as Greta Thunberg has pointed out. But my hope is that we can all come together and really radically change the way we're using our earth so that we can come through this crisis/opportunity. I want to talk a little bit. I was moved to just share about one solution that I know of. There's many solutions, but I think that what we do individually is important, and what organizations do is important, and what corporations do is important, and what the government does is important. As Dr. Talib has pointed out, we really need to get the governments to take action, because they are really important actors in the world. But governments don't take action unless the people push them to. Like, we need critical mass in terms of the people that know that the climate crisis is a problem, know that it impacts them, and know that it needs to be dealt with, and have a will to deal with it. And that public will push governments. And so I think it's both. So I want to give an example of this one organization that I learned about last year. It's called Sodden Forest. And I don't think that they would consider themselves a climate change organization. As I mentioned, there's all these interrelated crises, and they're all coming from the same common causes, and they all have the same common solutions. Okay, so here's Sodden Forest, and they started in India many years ago, and now they've reached out in Africa and South America, and they're doing these projects where they go to land that has been rendered, it's been desertified, it's been rendered infertile by the ways that we've used it, primarily by grazing animals, raising feed for animals. And then they teach the local people how to create food forests using permaculture principles, where they're doing water catchment. So they're in these very arid areas, in some cases where there's very little water, but because they're using practices that show wise stewardships, they're growing these incredible forests of food plants, so that people are able to become independent, feed themselves, renew the land so that it's fertile again, and at the same time, they're sequestering carbon, right? So they're doing their part to address the climate crisis. They're doing their part to address the biodiversity crisis, because the wild animals that went away now can come back. The water crisis, they're filling the aquifers by using this wise stewardship. So there's many, many things that we can do. And Sodden Forest is just one example. And I will put the link in the chat. But what I want to emphasize really is that what is called for is nothing short than a revolution in values. And for us as a human species to come together and to say that instead of being the exploiters of the earth, and instead of modeling our systems around whoever has the most money can do whatever they want to make more money, we must orient our systems around this idea of what can we do to ensure that all life thrives within the boundary of our earth systems, because all life is at stake. And that's the only approach that will bring us a solution that will be acceptable to all of humankind, whether we're living in the developed world or the developing world. If we destroy ourselves in the process of just being on the planet, then it's not worth it. And it's this idea of reducing. It was mentioned earlier, Gary. Thank you for bringing up reducing. I was reading an article in the Atlantic the other day, and it was about these different disparate groups that want humanity to go away because they think we're the problem on the earth. And one of the examples they used was Extinction Rebellion. And I don't like all of Extinction Rebellion's tactics, but I don't think that they want human life to go away from the earth. They are activists who are trying to stop the climate crisis so that human life can continue. And I want to say that it might be unpopular to say that we need to live more lightly on the earth. Those of us in the developed world, we need to stop saying, okay, I have a car and so I'm going to drive. I have this and so I'm going to use it. I'm going to get more and more and more. There's such a consumptive mentality. We can't live on the earth like this. We can't keep living with this consumptive mentality. So even as the developed world needs to be lifted, the developing world really needs to show some restraint in terms of how we use the earth and the resources that we use. And together we can do it. Together we can do it. I absolutely believe that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Martley, what's your concluding remarks?
Well, they're actually beginning and concluding remarks. Glad to be able to pop into this wonderful conversation and all of that. Climate change has absolutely been very important in my life and everything in that space. While I am primarily known as a journalist and, of course, involved with Pod TV and all of that, climate change has definitely played an important part in my life because there was a time when I was a youngster that I actually thought I wanted to be a weatherman. And I know that all of you that are here can remember the old days of the Farmer's Almanac. And that's just something that I still look at even to this day. And a lot of times I know that farmers around the country and around the world will look at the Farmer's Almanac to figure out what's going on with the climate. And then that will help them even in some of their thoughts around what they will plant and around some of their planting seasons. And surprisingly, even though we have all of this modern technology and everything, I have found that even in the year 2023, the Farmer's Almanac can be very accurate in the sense of the way that it lets you know what's going on with the climate and what's happening in the climate, not just here in the United States, but around the world and all in that space. And then the other thing that is very much been a climate conversation that was part of my life and everything was there is a notion, and I think that Reverend Beth kind of alluded to it, of environmental justice. And one of the places that I grew up in was the place of Warrenton, North Carolina. And for those of you that follow history and know about North Carolina, that is actually where the environmental justice movement started, because there were people that literally decided to dump in that area that I grew up in Warren County. And that was because it was poor and a minority community. So this whole notion of it happening in third world nations kind of climate spaces that are unfair is not just a third world or a second world problem. It is also a first world problem because, like I said, it was a poor area there in rural North Carolina and in Southern Virginia. And that is why that particular company decided to dump a chemical in that area. And there are still people that are feeling that effects, even though that happened way back in the late 70s. But there are still some people that are feeling the medical effects of that. And I don't know whether Reverend Beth or others have noticed it, but I've talked to several friends of mine, and there seems to be a rise in things that are impacted by climate to some degree. I heard one of you mention asthma, and I can't tell you how many folks that I've seen in my life that seem to be asthmatic. And I'm wondering if this is because some of the things that we are doing in the climate space that we are not paying enough attention to it. And that is why we have what I think is a rise in asthma. I don't have any concrete statistics around that, but I'm just going by my own personal experiences. And it does seem that we're seeing a rise in that and maybe some other health related things that are caused by our lack of support of things within the climate. And then last thing that I will mention just in my own climate journey is that, and you kind of referenced it, Reverend Beth, when you're talking about some of those activists, and some of those activists can be very harsh in the ways that they talk about things, but sometimes harsh messages are needed and all of that. Somewhere laying around this house of mine, or apartment, I should say, I have a copy of Ecotage. And many folks that remember the whole notion of climate activism will know that DeFox, who is the person that was behind Ecotage, was one that realized that some of our corporations can sometimes need the message taken to them in a harsh way. So he would literally do some things, I think that was back in the 60s and the 70s, where he might find like a area in the Midwest that was polluting the area. So he would literally find some of those dead fish and sneak into the president's office and dump those dead fish right there on their office in order for them to get the message that they needed to have these conversations around climate. And sometimes you have to give harsh messages like that in order to get the attention of corporations and all of that. And I don't know what kind of groups are like that in that space, but I do know that I was a fan of that particular book and of that particular activist. He has unfortunately passed on, and there may be others that are following in his footsteps and all along those lines. But I do think that climate is very important in our society, and too often we have a lot of climate deniers, folks that will tell you that, hey, it doesn't matter that the ice cap is melting. It doesn't matter that it is hotter. It doesn't matter that it's freaking almost 70 degrees in North Carolina in January. And that is exactly the temperature here today. It's like around 65 or 70 degrees in the middle of January. And some folks would be like, that's just the norm. And I'm going like, no, it's not. I remember when winters were actually a lot colder. They wouldn't be like Midwest cold, because I did go to school in Milwaukee, but they would be a little bit more seasonal than about 65 or 70 degrees, which is the high on today's particular day. And this is January 3rd, 2023. So if any of you are out there in the audience that are listening saying there can't be any climate changes, I would say look at your own weather and all in that space, because it definitely has seen some drastic changes that I've noticed over the last few years. And that's just one example that I can give you based on the weather forecast of this particular day in sunny North Carolina.
Thank you. Mr. Gary, what's your concluding remarks?
Thank you for everything. It's been a good day today. Yes, we went on a little longer than normal, so I won't speak too long. But I think one thing that we all do agree with is we do have a problem and we do have to get it solved. And I'd like to go back to the puzzle scenario where everything, I think big projects is like a puzzle. When you look at it as one big problem, it's unbeatable. But when you break it down into pieces, each of the pieces are achievable. And I think one of the main things that we need to do now is we just need to start like with fossil fuels. We need to start reducing the emissions it puts out in the bigger cities and the bigger developed countries. I spent 15 years in Uganda and 5 years in Ukraine. And, as Dr. said here, their problems, many times they used to tell me had the problems that America has. Their problem is waking up in the morning and wondering, do they have to walk 10 miles to go wash clothes today? Do they have to walk miles to go fetch water? That's their problems. But yes, they do have vehicles that do have higher emissions than most, but they're so few compared to the developed countries that it's the developed countries that has to take the bull by the horns and make it work. Okay, but it's got to be equal amongst everyone. You can't go to one area and say, okay, you guys have to get it down and get it right, because then we all live and die by the almighty dollar, as much as I hate to say it and hate to see it. But you have one group that does it, and all of a sudden, they go out of business or things bad happens to them, while the other groups are saying, oh, well, we don't have to do it, so we can, they don't have to spend the money. So it needs to be something that's done with everyone. We need to all sit down and go step by step, what we can do here and there. And I know we've done this a lot. One of the things, as I spoke earlier, that I'm pretty passionate about is lowering the emissions. And I have something that is a proven scenario that we can do. And if anybody would like to speak to me about it, it's too long to get into it on here now. I'm free to talk. Dr. Sharif has my information. You can go through him and get my email or my phone number, anything like that. I have no problem with it. And we can sit and discuss a true way forward, in a way that we can start now, today, bringing the emissions down and making it work. So thank you, Dr. Sharif. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate your ear, and I appreciate being on this forum.
Thank you. Dr. Talib, what's your concluding remarks?
Thank you so much. I have to leave after this immediately, but I wanted to say, because I want to thank each and every one of you. I thank you for your understanding of our problems in this part of the world. It's not a problem of isolated people. It's a problem of everyone. Every one of us has to deal with this problem. That's for sure. I think Mr. Gally said it very clearly. And Reverend Beth Love also said. Now, what do we do? I want to compare the climate change with COVID. COVID-19 also was an opportunity that laid in the crisis, like the Chinese word for opportunity and crisis are the same word. You're right, Reverend. Now, what the comparison here is that both things don't recognize borders at all. But the developing world is getting affected by that. So we have to do something. We have to do something together. Now, all the governments of the world have to work together. I say governments because governments are the ones responsible for education. Education is very important in this part of the world. It's all important all over the world. People have to know what they're doing, because otherwise they won't pay attention to it. Their day-to-day life problems are more pressing to them than this problem. Unfortunately, it's a fact. So what we need to do now is to go and okay.
Thank you. Thank you. This is excellent
Thank
discussion,
you.
especially for the emerging economy. We can learn a lot from today's sessions. And I want to give thanks to all of our speakers, Mr. David Schumacher, Madam Love, Beth Love, Mr. Gary, Professor Dr. Talib Raphael, Mr. Mark Lee, Mr. David Smith, and all of our speakers who continuously support in World Talent Economy Forum. And beside that, we are solving climate change problem with lot of initiative. Especially we work in right now. We are working with this Bangali community. We are working with 300 million people right now. So those who want to join in our action, beside this dialogue, you can join our team. We are open to team up with all of you, and we want to welcome you in Bangladesh or in India, and hopefully your initiative can change millions of people's life. So thank you everyone for joining today's sessions. I request all of our audience, please share our content with your government agency, corporation, and academy. As we are developing a lot of project, your dialogue, your knowledge, your expertise is extremely valuable for World Talent Economy Forum. Thank you. Bye bye and take care.